Hey guys, welcome to the K Nation Movement podcast. Today we're on episode 24 with Dr. Anthony G. J. He earned his Ph.D. in biochemistry. He's also studying at the Mayo Clinic, looking at stem cells, epigenetics, and infrared light. Today we discuss his book called Estrogeneration. We talk about why estrogen is important, how it ends up in our tap water, the effects it can have on your body, and how we can counter it. So I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Make sure you stay focused and be consistent. Well, thanks for taking the time to join us. I'm really excited about this podcast. I just finished listening to the one that you had with Dr. Paul Saladino. And that one was really interesting because Dr. Paul Saladino, I had him on our podcast a few weeks ago as well. And,
Nice.
he's awesome and he had some really great guests on his show. So when I listened to yours, I thought it was great and I couldn't wait to kind of pick your brain on a lot of things. And obviously the first thing first is, you got involved with research, but what was your background and what led you into that? And then eventually pursuing research at the Mayo Clinic.
Yeah. Are we recording too, by the way?
Yeah, we're recording as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I didn't want to
Yeah,
didn't want to launch into something.
yeah, no worries.
Yeah, no, I mean research. I've just always been kind of interested in health and in science and biochemistry. So my PhD is in biochemistry. And then I got into the estrogen stuff just because initially they gave a talk at my college about birth control in the drinking water. Like during orientation week, they said, make sure you filter your drinking water. There's a lot of birth control. And I never heard of this idea. And it kind of surprised me. It was somebody from the municipal, like somebody from the actual city down in Florida. And they said we were at sea level, so they recycle a lot of the water. So there's all this birth control because it doesn't get filtered out. But so that clearly put it on my radar. But then after that, I started paying more attention what's in the water other than just birth control. And I realized there's all these chemicals and a lot of them act like estrogen, and that was a big, eye opener for me. And obviously when I have kids, I don't want them to be exposed to these chemicals. They cause a lot of problems. So that's really where that all kicked off. It was way back in college. And then I did my PhD on hormones and cholesterol. And I ended up at the Mayo Clinic because my family's from Minnesota and my wife's family.
Right, that worked out pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's I'm fascinated by hormones as well, and my story I guess is similar to yours. I mean, when I was in my undergrad, I experimented with dieting just because I had put on not a freshman 15, it was more like a freshman 30. But I struggled with my weight in my first year of my undergrad, initially wanting to pursue dentistry, and then I got really fascinated by dieting, so I studied breast cancer and the relationship between obesity and carbohydrates, specifically sugar. And that was really interesting for me. But we looked at estrogen a little bit, not too much in my research, but a lot in our lab with some of our animal models. And it's a very, very interesting thing because, some of the research that I looked at with regards to estrogen and breast cancer, you talked about this a little bit too, but basically breast cancer rates have gone up significantly over the last 50 years. And according to, what I was listening to you discuss, it has a lot to do with increasing estrogen levels as well, not just the, insulin and sugar in our diet, but maybe a combination of the two.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, a lot of the time it's confusing because not a lot of people are doing blood tests and checking for BPA or checking for phthalates or checking for these xenoestrogens, these artificial estrogens. But when you do, you find a lot of them. And there's no question they're triggering the estrogen receptor. And so especially for people that are at risk for estrogen receptor positive breast cancer, it's a real issue for them.
Yeah, and so your research obviously led you to write a book, Estrogeneration. For anyone that doesn't know, the title is How Estrogenics Make You Fat, Sick, and Infertile.
Right.
And I like that title because it's straight to the point. Can you describe for people that are listening? I mean, a lot of people know what estrogen is, but can you describe the hormonal role of estrogen in the body why there's small amounts also in the male body, and what an estrogenic is,
Oh yeah,
like
yeah,
the pathway behind that.
yeah. Well, I'll start with estrogenic because basically natural estrogen is estrogenic. It acts like estrogen, obviously. Artificial estrogen is also estrogenic. So anything that acts like estrogen in your body is technically considered estrogenic. So it just means something that acts like estrogen. So natural estrogen, you know, it's interesting because most of the time, most people think men just have almost none and women have tons, right? Women are swimming in estrogen. But in reality, men have about 20 nanograms per liter, 20 nanograms per liter, and women also have about 20 nanograms per liter, but it goes up to about 400 depending on the time of the month. And so it's really not that different most of the time. And estrogen is really beneficial. Natural estrogen, it's really protective against plaque in your artery. It's protective for your brain and protective against dementia and things. There's a lot of benefits. So, having some estrogen is really important. And our body does a really good job of regulating that because you don't need much. You only need a small amount. It's really sensitive. We have estrogen receptors all throughout our body. I mean, we've got them in our fat cells, we got them in our liver, we got them in our brain, all these tissues, all these organs, and that's why the artificial estrogens are so darn disruptive because you start triggering that estrogen response in kind of an unnatural way, and then the body gets confused, right? I mean, there's the natural estrogen. One of the things about men is their testosterone goes down when they're exposed to these artificial estrogens. And, in nature, before we started man making these artificial estrogen chemicals, our testosterone was a lot higher in general. And when you have high testosterone, some of it gets aromatized and gets converted to estrogen, natural estrogen, of course, estradiol. And so then you have a ratio between estrogen and testosterone. So you have high testosterone and you have high estrogen, and that's protective in a lot of ways. So there's a lot of benefits to that, as long as your testosterone is also high, right? It's a ratio. It's like omega-3 versus omega-6. That ratio is really important. Everybody's all filled up with omega-6s, and they don't have omega-3s these days, So the testosterone-estrogen ratio is super important. And we've got it all mixed up because our testosterone is super low and our natural estrogen is kind of here and there. It's all over the place, but the artificial estrogens are super high in people. I mean, in the thousands of nanograms per liter, so that's really high, and it's triggering this estrogen response, and it's not even triggering it in a positive way. Like, it's not protecting our arteries. It's not protecting our brain. It's triggering it, or it's triggering our estrogen response in a real negative way, like store more fat cells. It's those kind of switches. Depression, like postpartum depression, when pregnant women, have massive changes in their hormones, their estrogen, they get depression sometimes. That happens with these artificial estrogens. Things like that,
Right.
real problems.
Yeah. Yeah, and that makes sense from a physiological and biological perspective. And you just mentioned, one of my next questions was the relationship between these estrogenics and how they actually make you fat, sick, and infertile. But clearly, they're affecting your testosterone levels. They're affecting your fat cells, your ability to store fat.
Yep. Yep.
Um,
Yeah, and they store in your
yeah.
fat. I mean, a lot of people don't realize, you know, there's two totally different things going on. And number one is they're triggering your cells to store more fat. So it's like a fat switch. It's like flipping on a switch. And so they're just. But then number two, these chemicals actually store inside the cells as well, the fat cells. So they're in there, and they're hard to get out because a fat cell can live a year and a half on average. They live a year and a half. They've even found fat cells that live 10 years, and we're doing these radioactive studies with people that were exposed to the atomic bomb. Yeah, so that can be a problem if you've got these chemicals in your fat cells and they're constantly communicating to the cells to store more fat, you know. and you can't get them out because they're sitting in there. So that's where the sauna really comes in. I tell people use the sauna. It really helps to speed up molecular motion, get these things out, and stop rubbing them on your skin. Stop putting them in your mouth, drinking the
Yeah.
plastic bottles, all the stuff. All the sources.
Right. And, you know, I want to come back to the sauna and as well infrared light to combine with that. But before we move on, you briefly mentioned depression. And, I think there's a lot that can be said about our environment. Obviously, our diet and our lack of physical activity plays a huge role with that as well. I never knew that estrogen had anything to do with depression.
Oh yeah.
Are there research papers or articles that do like a meta-analysis of any specific places where they see depression rates affected by, say, estrogenics in certain ways?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's hard to quantify because people lie on those tests. If you ask them if they're depressed, people say
Yeah.
no because they don't want the insurance companies or they don't want some weird legal issues there. Like suddenly the government's trying to take away your guns or whatever because you're feeling a little sad for some reason. But no, but the metric that I like to look at is suicide because that's really a solid metric if you're going to study depression. And like, for example, birth control users have more suicide. And there was a big giant study with over 100,000 people. And they showed that was significant. They've also shown that a lot of these estrogens, like, for example, you find more depression and suicide in children that have higher BPA in their urine. So, I mean, this is like you just go down the list of the different chemicals and you find depression if you're really looking out for it. Atrazine is another one. They introduced atrazine over in India. And atrazine is a herbicide that's estrogenic. So it's the second most used herbicide in North America. They don't even allow it to be utilized. It's illegal in Europe because it's so problematic. It acts like estrogen. It wrecks the wildlife have all kinds of sexual issues and infertility issues and whatnot. And I mean, not to mention depression, right? Like you can kind of quantify depression in some of these animal models, although that's tricky. But in Europe, in India, when they introduced atrazine, the suicide rates just exploded. And I talk about this in my book because nobody is pointing a finger to atrazine or these estrogen chemicals. They're all just saying we can't understand why. Maybe it's because alcohol is rising a little bit, or something. Like they're all just kind of making these random guesses. But look at the atrazine, right? When we see this pattern over and over with these estrogen chemicals, it shouldn't be surprising. It's like the breast cancer, right? Like people are raising awareness for breast cancer, but nobody's telling us why it's rising so much. Like it's not awareness that we need. It's we need to understand. We need to start avoiding these estrogens so then we don't get the breast cancer. We don't just need to be aware of the problem. We have to actually make an easy change, right? It's not that hard to avoid atrazine or just straight up make it illegal, which is what Europe did. But I mean, here we are in America, 10 years later, and they're still using it.
Yeah, and it's a paradox, I think, of living in North America because
Right.
technically our lifestyles are a lot more convenient and luxurious than other countries in the world,
Right.
but we lack heavily in other areas. You look at it from an estrogenic hormonal perspective and why there's a lack of care for herbicides in our water and estrogen in our water, and then I tackle it from the other angle of diet and exercise. I mean, how are we the fattest continent in the world? Why are we losing more men to heart disease than any other country in the world? Why are our obesity rates in the 30 to 40% range when we have access to resources, we have convenient lifestyles? And you mentioned something about estrogen having a protective effect to a certain level. Well, I see that the same way from food. Insulin has a very specific role in the human body, and you need it. And I think the shift towards a more processed diet with ridiculous kinds of carbohydrates coming in, Frankenstein foods, they overkill that insulin pathway, and that has a heavy role with things like breast cancer, obesity, and cancer in general. We look at the insulin pathway and IGF, and it's this hyperactivation of it over a long period of time And the same can be said with estrogen. It's not, having one plastic water bottle and then you develop breast cancer. It's
Right.
having, your water bottles and then your sunscreen, your deodorant, whatever it might be. There's a lot of environmental factors that are chronic over a long period of time. And I think they really combine to be dangerous, especially when they come from all different directions in your environment.
Exactly. No, 100%. And I mean, yeah, it's kind of a worst of both worlds when you throw in all the carbs that people are eating for sure. um, yeah, they did a study that was interesting on rats because the beauty of it was they can control all the food and you know the exercise presumably is the same. They gave them all exactly the same calories. They had two separate groups. One group got pure clean water, and the second group got low dose atrazine in the water that mimics the amount that we're getting, and that group got fat. You know, so it's clear that like irrespective of calories, these estrogens can trigger fat gains, and it's exactly like you say. I mean, the long term fat gains are a huge part of the problem because people don't you don't notice it. It sneaks up on you. It takes years, and then it can take years to undo, which is also a problem. Um, and that's it's more discipline than most people can handle. but like you say, going keto or something like that can really exacerbate. It can really amplify the speed of it. You can help out your metabolism a lot quicker if you know what you're doing. Um,
Hmm.
in terms of getting these estrogens out, especially if you're burning fat, teach your body to burn
Hmm.
fat.
Hmm.
So yeah,
Yeah, and I'm a big advocate for keto. I mean, I studied that specifically in my master's.
hmm,
In our lab, we tried to mimic a ketogenic environment in our breast cancer cell cultures.
yeah,
I specifically didn't work with an animal model, but I did try to create the closest ketogenic model I could based on our resources at the time. So we tested ketone levels from 0 to 14 millimolars, which is obviously
super
extremely
high.
high.
Hmm.
We tested about 5 or 6 levels in between, and then obviously in the range of physiological levels.
Hmm.
And then we also matched that with glucose levels from, I believe it was 0 to anywhere from 10 to 20 millimolars. And so we tried to find, at the level where you'd see in the human body in a ketogenic diet, which would be around 3 to 5, millimolars of glucose, fasting, and then anywhere from 1.5 to about 7 millimolars of ketones, probably around 3 being the sweet spot, maybe 2 to 3. Um, it was a difficult thing to test with treatment media because you need enough media to grow these breast cancer cells, but you also want to see if you're affecting certain kinases that maybe slow down cancer growth. We looked at P27 and a lot of AKTs,
Hmm.
and the results were pretty interesting. I mean, we saw a spike in proteins like P27 that slow down, certain transitions between the G1 and S phase in the cell cycle of cancers. And then we saw a downregulation of things like AKT, which obviously helps speed up that cycle of the cancer along. They're more like a gas pedal. So we were able to activate the brakes of the cancer cell cycle and kind of slow down the gas pedal of the cell cycle, if that's a easy way of putting it. Now, it was in a cell culture model. There's a lot more testing to be done, but it was really interesting to take something that we see in studies being done, and we see a lot of humans benefiting from it, and then trying to mimic it in the lab and seeing, like, can we really show that there's a sweet spot in there based on what people would achieve when they're on this diet. And so that was interesting for me because the keto diet was how I lost a whole ton of weight when I was struggling with carbs.
Hmm.
I was in school and I couldn't burn off the carbs that I was eating because I wasn't in high school anymore. I wasn't playing sports twice a day, and I didn't understand it. It was a very weird thing to accept. And so luckily I discovered keto in a nutrition class, and I kind of ran with it. We're not so much a keto company now. I mean, we make we do supplements. We have, grass-fed collagen protein bars coming in the pipeline. But, I strongly believe in the low sugar, low carbohydrate approach, whether it's paleo or keto.
Right.
I think that people could benefit greatly from just removing processed foods and refined sugar from their diet, whatever
Yeah.
their intention is at the end of the day.
100%. Where did you do your studies?
So we're actually based out of Toronto, and I studied at York University.
Nice.
It's a big university here, and we have one of the biggest kinesiology programs in Canada. So it was interesting. I mean, and this is kind of funny because I'm sure you're well aware of resveratrol.
Oh yeah.
And when I had gone into my lab, we kind of had these experiments lined up with doing resveratrol on breast cancer, and
Mhm.
they showed promising results in breast cancer cells,
Right.
but there were other labs that had researched it in mice, and they saw that the dose that you needed in order to see any effects was
Super.
insane. It would never be achieved in the human body. I mean, you'd need to take an insane amount of resveratrol.
Right.
And so for me, it was the point where I said, you know what, let's do something that maybe is more applicable instead of focusing our time on something where we will just be chasing our own tail for a couple of years. So
Oh yeah.
it turned out good. It was really frustrating to get the experimental model set up because it what didn't exist in the literature, but I had a lot of fun getting creative with it, and obviously it's research, so it gets frustrating at times when things aren't going your way, which felt like most of the time. But yeah, finished it up, and it turned out to be a pretty cool experiment overall.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Hmm.
How do they get funding up there? Do they have like an NIH equivalent? I don't know much about Canada research.
Yeah, exactly. We have our own funding, and we had some really cool data published from our prior Ph.D. student who's now in medical school. But he looked at mice, and he looked at the effects of exercise, and he looked at the effects of lean adipose tissue versus fatty adipose tissue.
Hmm.
And so, for people who are listening and don't know, there's a big difference between the fat tissue of someone who's obese and the hormonal profiles they release versus someone who is leaner and still has fat tissue. I mean, nobody has zero fat tissue on them. And they looked at how in an obese person, the fat tissue actually promotes cancer growth, when in a lean person, it helps slow it down. And that was a really cool study. They looked really in depth at the adiponectin leptin ratios, and it was very well done. And so that was a big source of our funding, but also just reading the research in general and kind of confirming the idea. I mean, we kind of already know that eating a good diet and exercising has protective effects against cancer, but seeing the literature done and how well the experiment was done, I thought was really interesting. And so that was one of the big experiments in our lab. We have a very small lab, but it was very cool.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating. Hmm.
And I know we just talked about this, but you briefly mentioned the sauna and sweating out toxins. And I think obviously people, they go into saunas or steam rooms for the health benefits. The word toxins gets thrown out a lot. Obviously, people may not know the specific toxins or what they're actually sweating out, but it's clear that going into a sauna makes you feel good. I didn't start using a steam room till a couple of months ago, and I would go once a week, and I would go on Monday nights. It was one of the best ways to start my week because I would do a workout, and then I would jump into the steam room for about 20 minutes, take a bit of a cold shower afterwards, and it was like it was extremely relaxing. It helped me sleep very well, and I always felt amazing the next day. I felt very refreshed. So I'm more new to the whole sauna and steam room thing, but I found a lot of benefits right away from doing it. And then I've been reading more and more about infrared
Hmm.
light and how that can help with your health. And there's a company that does infrared saunas. So I was
Yeah.
like, that would be a really cool addition to have to the house every night, before you go to bed. Get into your infrared sauna for 20 minutes, sweat everything out, take a shower, go to bed. And that would probably be, one of the best pre-bed routines ever
Yep.
for relaxing and being able to sleep stress-free. So can you talk about some of the toxins that might come out of a sauna steam room and what the benefits of infrared light may be?
Oh yeah, for sure. So a lot of people, they say there's no studies showing that we sweat out toxins, which is crazy because there are studies. They do what's called BUS studies, BUS, blood, sweat, and urine, or blood, urine, and sweat. Um, and they basically put a skin patch on people that it's like a nicotine patch without nicotine on it, and then they just basically have people walk around with that thing. And the people that sit in the saunas, they have groups of people that don't sit in saunas, groups of people that do sit in saunas. The people that actually sit in the sauna with those things, they pull off that patch and measure the chemicals, and they're just full of BPA and phthalates and all these artificial estrogen chemicals. You're sweating them out. Um, And so it's important to get a good shower after you
Yeah.
get out of the sauna because you want to wash that stuff off your skin.
Right.
And it definitely is taken up on your skin,
Yeah.
just like testosterone is, and can come right out as
Hmm.
well.
Yeah. And then does infrared light have a similar effect in
Oh yeah,
terms
well,
of
especially if you sweat. I think people really need to sweat, but infrared is unique because it can get inside a lot deeper. Um, just like an infrared grill or something like that, that it can cook, from the inside, and it speeds up molecular motion way deep inside. So that's gonna increase your urine output of these chemicals, and it's like I say, sweating is really important as well, I think. But um, if you add an infrared, then you're kind of killing two birds with one stone as long as it's hot.
right. That's fascinating. I mean, I've always wanted to give it a try, so I think I might have to do that next. Um, there was one thing that I heard from a podcast with Dr. Saladino, and it was regarding a frog experiment. I found that very interesting.
Hmm.
So can you talk a little bit about that? And I think it was a frog submerged in
Atrazine.
water. Yeah, in
Yeah.
atrazine.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah, they did. They've done a bunch of studies with frogs and some of these estrogen chemicals because they sit in water, right? I mean, so their skin absorbs the chemicals. And basically, at 200 nanograms per liter of atrazine, you can change a male frog into a female, basically. Um, Oftentimes, they just call it reproductive abnormalities, but there are scientific papers that will actually call it male feminization if they're being honest, But most people worry about the politics and the
Right,
political climate we're in, so they
right,
don't want to say male feminization, but
right,
that's what it is.
right.
That's
But
what
that's
it
what it
is. I mean,
is. Yeah.
yeah. So the craziest part about that whole issue is 200 nanograms per liter changes a male frog to a female frog, and 3,000 nanograms per liter is legally allowed in our drinking water.
Wow.
So yeah, and you can always argue, well, how much is taken up and this and that, but I mean, to be honest, probably all of it. If
Hmm.
you're drinking it. So people really need to filter their drinking water with activated charcoal, and
Right.
most filters have that. If you just get a filter, it's got carbon or activated charcoal. Those are all the same things. Those are all synonyms.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, it's super critical that people use those because I've used them in peer-reviewed science research. They pull the estrogens out, they pull out the hormones, um, and they're cheap. It's cheap to buy carbon or activated carbon. So even you know, I use reverse osmosis um, at my house, and it's a stainless steel unit that has a pump in it, so there's no
Hmm.
storage tank. The company is called Purify Guru, like Guru,
Hmm.
and it pumps through a cotton filter first, which just gets out the big chunks like iron. But then it gets the next one is activated charcoal, and then it's got the reverse osmosis filter or the membrane, and then the final chamber. It's four chambers. The final chamber is a remineralizer that puts magnesium back into it and things.
Hmm.
And you can just turn it on and let it run all day long, which is a problem when you've got kids like I do. But so you got to make sure the kids don't just turn it on and leave the room.
Yeah.
But it's a great system because it's all stainless steel and there's no plastic storage tank, giant storage tank under your sink.
Hmm.
And it's just there's like nothing wrong with it in my opinion. But again, you don't have to go that expensive. That was about a $500 system.
Right.
Um, but you can just get like a regular plastic pitcher and filter into that and just pour it. And once you filter, I say pour it into a glass pitcher. That's probably a good business opportunity for somebody. They need to make more glass pitchers, with
Yeah.
filters on them, like a
Yeah.
Brita
I guess
system
I've
with
never
glass.
actually seen that.
No, there is one. I went to somebody's house to do a podcast in Santa Monica, California. Jay Ferrugia. I went to his place and he had a glass filter that was shaped like a one of those coffee things. I'm blanking on the name. With like a pour over, like those pour over coffee units.
Right. Right. Right.
Um, Gosh. But anyways, it was shaped like that, and it was a water filter. It was pretty cool, but it was real expensive.
Yeah. Well, I bet. But that's and I might get shamed for this, but I've been drinking tap water since I can remember. I
Yeah.
don't remember the last time we
Uh,
had a filter in my house or a Brita or I mean, I just never really saw anything wrong with tap water. I mean, basically, till recently, till I listened to your podcast and started reading into it more prior to getting you on the show. I drink a lot of water. I mean, it's always been a priority for me. I drink. There's always a cup of water by my bed. You know, I'll drink a lot of water before I go to sleep. I drink a lot of water through the day. I typically fast till around 1 or 2 in the afternoon. So I'm drinking water in the morning to keep myself full, and then I'll go to the gym and drink a whole ton of water. It's all tap water. I'm realizing now might not be the best
Yeah.
thing, but you know, like you said, there's small amounts of not just estrogen but herbicides and estrogenics. So I may have to look into getting a Brita or something for my own house, just based on how much tap water I do consume.
Oh yeah. No, it's worth it. Otherwise, you're fighting an uphill battle. The
Yeah.
coffee thing is called Chemex, like Chemex, Chemex. I was just trying to think of the name a minute ago.
Oh yeah, no worries. Okay, so CHEMEX for anyone listening, and I'll definitely have to check that out myself.
Yeah, I mean that's what I
Um,
use to make coffee.
yeah,
It's like a pour over thing. It's kind of cool. It
right.
takes a little bit of extra time. Oftentimes I just do cold press or cold press, I guess you call it, or cold
Mm-hmm.
brew, where you just put
Right.
coffee in a hemp filter, and then you just leave it overnight,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, at the room temperature in a glass
Right.
container. That's how I've been
Right.
making coffee recently because it's really condensed and tastes really good.
Yeah, it's got that caffeine too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, because there's actually a study. Speaking of coffee, they did a study with decaf versus regular coffee where they poured them into BPA. You know, these plastic mugs people drink out of and they carry
Mm-hmm.
around in their car and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
They poured hot coffee into those. One of them was decaf, one group was decaf, one was regular, and the regular coffee actually there's 25% more leaching of BPA into the regular.
Hmm.
So even
You
just
know,
having caffeine helps to leach. It helps transfer more BPA molecules out of your plastic and into your coffee. So you got to
wow.
use glass or ceramic or something or stainless steel. You know,
Wow, that's interesting. It's something I would never even think of, the difference between decaf and caffeine on the
right?
effect of BPA.
Oh yeah,
You know, there's also another thing I believe you talk about in your book. You know, the concern of cannabis consumption and estrogen
yeah.
levels. This is kind of a side question, but I was curious about the consumption of alcohol as well. And
No,
would you include CBD? I mean, I don't take CBD. I don't smoke cannabis, but you know, CBD oil is the new craze, it seems like, and it's in everything: chocolate, hand cream,
right.
you know, you name it. It's supposed to be a great painkiller. But is there a concern of cannabis? Is that just the THC, or are there problems with CBD as well and alcohol?
Alcohol is separate. I mean, alcohol doesn't act like estrogen, but the hops have this chemical that starts with a P, and I can't remember the full name of it, but it can act like estrogen.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but some of the fermentation products, like the yeast, can break that down. So, like how much is in each individual beer varies so widely
Mm-hmm.
that it's pretty hard to predict how much estrogen you're going to get from drinking beer.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the marijuana products, it's a lot easier to predict. It's basically if you're smoking them, you're getting estrogen. If you're eating edibles, you're not getting estrogen. Like the
Why is
THC
that?
doesn't act like estrogen, CBD does not act like estrogen. It's only the smoke for some reason. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so a lot of teenagers, for example, you find like they struggle with infertility if they do a lot of smoking and marijuana.
Mm-hmm.
Later in their life, they struggle with low testosterone, oftentimes depression. It's hard to disentangle some of that because, you know, number one, it's been illegal, so nobody comes forward and admits that they're using it.
Yeah.
Um, and then number two, oftentimes people that are depressed are doing and then they try cannabis, and then the
Right.
scientists blame the cannabis for the depression or something. Like there's a lot of user selection bias, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but no, I mean actually just looking at cell studies and estrogen receptor activation, like I say, it's only the smoke, and we've known that since like 1983, I think.
Wow.
But it's been validated further more recently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's you know, we legalized cannabis here in Canada last year, and they're doing the rollout of edibles, I believe, later this year. And yeah, there's I mean, there's a lot of science behind the strains, and a lot of people
Well,
are getting off of pain medication and taking certain strains, and then they're getting off of antidepressants or anti-anxiety medicine and taking certain strains. And
right.
the smoke maybe is not the most ideal, but for that person, if you had to weigh the pros and cons of taking a prescription med that sometimes makes your depression even worse, that might be the lesser of two evils, especially if there are other forms, like you said, edibles that someone can take.
Right.
So it's
Oh
interesting.
yeah.
That's good to know that CBD is not, an edible form. It's just more the smoke than anything.
Right.
And are there certain foods that can increase estrogen? For example, I would think refined foods, but are there even natural foods or anything in specific that may increase estrogen or reduce testosterone?
Well, I mean, I've looked at studies just for increasing testosterone, right? And
Mm-hmm.
certainly the keto diet increases testosterone, and oftentimes people get confused about that. The researchers, they
Mm-hmm.
don't understand why, but it just does.
Mm-hmm.
But I
Yeah.
mean, it makes sense to me because you got healthier gut bacteria, you've got more cholesterol coming in, which can be utilized to make more testosterone, and that's a good thing. You're burning
Mm-hmm.
more fat. Um, but which ones raise estrogen? I'm not as I don't see it in the studies as much. Obviously, it's a chicken and egg issue, right? If you're eating a ton of refined sugar or something, you're going to get fatter, and then having the
Yeah.
fat cells can raise a lot of estrogen because you're
Right.
aromatized too much testosterone. So there, it's like, well, which one came first? But in terms of the artificial estrogens, I mean, that's what I focus on for the most part because I see that as like a bigger hidden issue that people aren't
Mm-hmm.
even thinking. It's not even on the radar. Like at least carbs is on people's radar, at least
Yeah.
eating whole foods and healthy, you know,
Yeah.
non-processed foods is people are talking about that, but I feel like not a lot of people are recognizing, like one of the problems with these processed meats is they're full of phthalates. That's a plastic chemical, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Then they got parabens. Like you go to the store and you try and get some corn tortillas
Yeah.
and look on the ingredient. It's got methylparaben and propylparaben and butylparaben. These are like preservatives. They're
Yeah.
using them as preservatives, but they act like estrogen. Um, and it's absurd. It's absurd. It's crazy. And then the personal care products have those parabens as well,
Yeah. I
and
mean,
nobody's talking about that.
yeah, it's under the radar, and I think a lot of that has to do with big corporations that benefit a lot from keeping it under the radar. Obviously, they have their own agenda, and I know you talked about BPA and how there's different. I believe it was variations or isomers like BPA C or BPC that
BS. Yep.
companies can now get away with because they
Right.
don't call it BPA, and we've you know
Right.
cracked down on BPA, but there's so many other ones that are just as harmful, but just have a different name that
Exactly.
people can get away with. So,
Hmm.
the to my question, I guess we could sum it up by just saying, stick to glass containers and or stainless steel water bottles and avoid plastic when you can, because I mean, you never know. They could say BPA free, and you never know what's going to end up in that plastic that they made. Um, Now, leading into is kind of some of my last questions to sum things up. You study epigenetics.
Yep.
Epigenetics to me is a very interesting field, and it's almost like, and correct me if I'm wrong, we can look at certain things that affect maybe our DNA phenotype that can be passed down to generations. I don't
Hmm.
think people know that your behavior, your physical activity, your diet, your environment can actually be transferred on even in one generation.
Right.
And that to me is interesting, but also kind of scary for certain people who don't take good care of their health and are passing on genes. Then that gene pool is just going to get worse if those behaviors don't change. So can you talk about the role of epigenetics? And I believe that's what you also study specifically at your clinic as well.
Oh yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, epigenetics are marks on top of the DNA, so they're
Mm-hmm.
physically on the DNA. So that's how they get passed on. So when you pass on your DNA, you also pass on the marks that are on the DNA,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, you can definitely change those. I mean, estrogen. One of the unique aspects of estrogen is it goes into the cell, which some hormones do, some hormones don't. But it goes through the cell membrane inside the cell, but not only does it go into the cell, it goes into the nucleus where the DNA is, and that
Right.
has its own membrane. So there's, almost nothing goes into the nucleus, but estrogen does. And so do these artificial estrogens. And then they start changing these epigenetic marks. And then it gets passed on. So you may or may not have health problems from your estrogen exposures, but the next generation will have health problems. And then the future generation, they've even done studies with mice, and they can show 4 generations of health effects. And in many cases, it actually expands. Like the fertility decreases a little bit in the first generation, the next generation, and it actually, that you get way more infertility in the 4th generation than you got in the 2nd generation. Similar with asthma, um, Kate Shanahan, she showed me a study regarding asthma and smokers. So if your
Mm-hmm.
grandmother smoked, um, you're actually, and you're the and you're the right, and your mother had I think it was a 1.5-fold increased risk of asthma, but then you as a daughter would actually have a 1.8-fold increase risk for
Wow.
asthma. It
Even
actually
if your
goes
mom
up.
didn't smoke, just from your grandma?
Even when your mom didn't, exactly, only when your mom didn't smoke. If your mom smoked, then it even exacerbates it more. But that's
Wow.
just, yeah. And of course, that study was just done with women. And and I mean, there's aspects of estrogen to the cigarette smoke as well.
Mm-hmm.
But there's so many other things compounding. Like, there's so many variables there with cigarette smoke. There's so much junk in that stuff.
Right.
But yeah, it's a scary. That's the scariest part of epigenetics is
Mm-hmm.
we're passing it on to our kids, and oftentimes we're making it worse for their generation. So this is the thing, right? Like if your parents ate super unhealthy, they ate all this crappy food, and then they say, yeah, diet doesn't really matter because we ate all this crap, and we're still, our
Yeah.
body mass index is reasonable, and we're not fat and all this, and then all the kids are fat.
Yeah.
It's like, well, yeah, but you still messed up your kids. You know what I mean? Like, so it doesn't seem as much of a primary cause. It doesn't seem like to them, right? To people that where their offspring are getting fatter and fatter, they don't think they're at fault. They think everything their kids are doing is at fault, but in reality, it started with them, and it's probably a huge component of it.
Right. And, you see that a lot with certain people where they have arguments to why they behave the way that they behave, and they think that it's justified. Like I've heard people say, well, I'm in my 60s and I'm still here, so I'm going to smoke cigarettes anyways, and it's not going to affect you, so why would you worry? And now you're presenting an argument that literally shows on a scientific level that no, you could affect future generations to come. And I think if people knew that, then maybe just maybe they'd be a little bit more conscious of their behaviors, at least knowing that it affects more than just themselves. Um,
Oh yeah.
yeah, and
No,
I
I
have
agree. I mean,
to, yeah, I have to mention here, we see a big uh, culture of fear, and I hope people that are listening know these podcasts aren't out of instilling you to be scared and like hide in your house and worry about every little thing, but it's just to make you more aware and conscious of certain things. And if you can just do small actions to improve your health, then they're probably worth doing. I mean, things as simple as opting away from plastic water bottles. I mean, water, we shouldn't be paying for water anyways, but if you can avoid plastic water bottles, and if you're going to get a Tupperware, get a glass one instead of a plastic one. If you can get a water filter, get a water filter. But I think the point is to try to always stick to natural ingredients, whether that's in food, deodorants, the bottles, whatever food you're buying. At the end of the day, the lessons kind of come back together, and they're quite clear. It's just basically live a natural lifestyle as closely as you can, avoid chemicals when possible. Um, and if you could sum all of this up with a few pieces of advice, or even one piece of advice on how people can counter this, that they're not aware of with things in their water and their products, how can they counter this as best they can in order for men to boost their testosterone and women to make sure their estrogen stays at a healthy range?
yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is just educating yourself on what these estrogens are and just avoiding them with the biggest, most common offenders because they're additive, right? Like if you've got plastics and then you've got personal care products and then you're putting on sunscreen,
Hmm.
all of these have estrogens. And so you're compounding the problem by adding all these different things. So figure out the sources and then find the ones that are easy and cheap. I mean, filtering your water is cheap, it's easy. And so
Yeah.
is buying personal care products that are good and supplements that are good. And, just get those, the big ones. And if you've got a really high risk for breast cancer or something else, I mean, then you can go really extreme. Or if you're a professional athlete or whatever, then you want to go even further. But at least, I think everybody should be doing certain basic things that, again, just revolve around educating yourself on these chemicals.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's great advice. That's a really good place to kind of wrap it all up. I know that I'll probably be getting a water filter sometime soon and continuing to go to the steam and sauna room and experiment with infrared light. I mean, it sounds interesting. I'll see if I can see any personal effects or changes or maybe something noticeable. And that'll be really something really cool to experiment with. So thank you for coming on the show. It was a pleasure. I had a lot of questions here and you helped answer all of them. So hopefully our listeners enjoy this one. And yeah, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having.
Yeah, we really appreciate it.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. We'll connect soon and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
All right, you too.
Okay, take care.
Yep.
Bye bye.